Good evening.
Good evening.
I don't know, some of you may know who I am, some of you might not. My name is Mandy Muehlhausen. I'm the director here at the Spencer Public Library. I'd like to thank you all for attending tonight. I would also like to thank our panel, Ann Slattery and Mandy King and Vanessa Moore, who will be joining us, and Jacqueline Johnson, who has been so gracious to help facilitate this discussion and transform the group, Transforming the Connection. So if you're interested in that group or more programs like this, please let us know. We want to bring things that matter to you here. I always say that there's nothing more punk rock than libraries. So libraries are notoriously, have been historically subversive. So we talk about the things that nobody else wants to talk about. And I think that this program is one of those things. And we're hoping that in doing so, it isn't subversive anymore. So we don't want to be subversive. We want to do the things that are right in society. So I think that's all. I'd like to thank my staff who have been incredibly helpful and patient with me and with setup. I just want to let you know, if you have any suggestions for future programs or books that you think that we should add to our collection regarding anything, whether it be fiction or regarding issues that you are interested in, feel free to come in and talk to us or send us an email at libraryinfo@spenceriowacity.com. All right, thank you so much for coming. Enjoy.
Good evening. My name is My name is Jacqueline Johnson, and I'm your moderator for Transforming the Connections, collaboration with the Spencer Public Library, in presenting the featured documentary in honor of the men and women who paved the way for the end of slavery and dehumanization during the slave trade and the revolts leading up to its abolition. Between 1791 and 1804, the Saint Dominique Revolution in the West Indies led to the abolition of slavery in the former French colony and the establishment of Haiti. It was the first Western nation to be governed by a person of African descent. As we keep Haiti in our thoughts, as they engage in recovery and rescue efforts from a 7.2 earthquake that killed more than 2,200 people on Saturday, August 15, 2021. Welcome to tonight's discussion of Slavery by Another Name, the re-enslavement of Black people in America from the Civil War to World War II. The dilemma of a contemporary society, of how a contemporary society should grapple with a troubled past, is complex. Legalized slavery was abolished in America on December 18, 1865. However, thousands of Black Americans were forced into labor long past this date and the Civil War. Slavery by Another Name highlights how a form of neo-slavery thrived long after the legal abolition of antebellum slavery. Millions of Black men were subject to a system known as debt slavery or peonage. The system made Black men vulnerable to arrest and ultimately criminalized Black lives. Statutes were passed to make Black men and women, though it was men who were overwhelmingly victims, vulnerable to arrest at all times in almost any place in the South, unless he has the explicit protection of a white man. Statutes of vagrancy were reinstated where Black men and women had to prove that they were employed. Yet this was an era where there was no pay stubs or proof of employment for a farm laborer. The only evidence was the verbal affirmation of a white farmer to say that Negro works for me or he is mine. So, protection in the voice of a white man is the only way that a Black man could demonstrate that he is employed. It became a crime if he was unable to provide the white man that would vouch for him. The narrative that existed at the time was that there was a crime wave right after the Civil War of blacks who were ill-equipped for freedom, and that arrests were necessary to keep the peace. The evidence showed that the chaos was in fact white Southerners attacking other white Southerners. Also, there was evidence that white Southerners were attacking Black Americans, settling the score from the Civil War or the KKK to attack Black leaders or any Black person who attempted to participate in elections or any community organization. After the Civil War, white Americans in the Deep South faced great hardship. The South was paralyzed and needed to support the crumbling cotton industry. So there was an economical need to replace the 4 million Black lost forced laborer on whom they relied prior to the Civil War. Blacks would provide labor without wages, and hence the re-enslavement of Black Americans. The fate of the Black man and the role of the Black man in America is shaped during this time. Many kinds of statutes became legal and made it impossible for Blacks to move freely in the South. There were periods of time where no crimes were reported. Then suddenly, crimes were reported as large groups of Black men were arrested and charged with crimes such as vagrancy. This effectively made it impossible for Black men to live in security and not in jeopardy of constant arrest. Within a day or two of being picked up, Black men were then picked up by a labor agent to be sent to a coal mine, a lumber yard, or some commercial or industrial enterprise or plantation. The fines would be paid by the labor agent. For example, a man charged with vagrancy could be charged with fees amounting to sometimes as much as 2 years' wages. To understand what this is like, it is the equivalent of being charged with a traffic ticket and being charged $40,000 to $50,000. Of course, Black men were unable to pay these penalties, and the law allowed them to be bought by industries and individuals willing to pay their fines. They were supposedly held for a year or two to pay back those wages, though in many cases, they were held long past their sentences. They were taken to these commercial institutions where they faced shocking treatment and working conditions, including but not limited to no food, no medical care, terrible housing. They worked in coal mines standing in waist-deep water, sometimes for days and weeks at a time. Under these horrible, putrid circumstances, the mortality rates were as high as 30% to 40% of men who worked or were faced in these coal mines could die before their time was up. Other crimes included walking on a railroad line, speaking loudly in the company of a white woman, selling the produce of your farm after dark. While it was never specific to only Black men, overwhelmingly, Black men were charged with these crimes. This went on for 60 to 70 years after it began. In every Southern state, it was a crime for a farm worker who was employed by one white man to seek employment elsewhere unless he had permission from his employer. So, if you were being abused by a landowner or a sharecropper, you could not seek employment elsewhere without asking your abuser's permission. Arrest records indicate that there were tens of thousands of Black men who were arrested and sold as convict laborers or forced laborers to a different white man or into an industrial enterprise or taken back to the initial employer to work for no wages and chained as convicts working in the fields. The system of chain gangs were an outgrowth of these practices. The end result of this, returning 4 to 7 million Black laborers into a new kind of neo-slavery of involuntary servitude that became more terrible than antebellum slavery. This created an economic reconstruction of the South, but also became an instrument of political terrorism as Black men were targeted under the sanctions imposed to prevent them from participating in activities such as voting. Blacks were terrorized and intimidated away. from participating in the political process. Through these mechanisms, both the economic needs of the South were achieved, economically and politically. These practices continued right up until World War II. It was the policy of the Department of Justice not to investigate allegations of slavery or involuntary servitude anywhere in the country up until 1941, 4 days after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. This was based on the legal technicality that while slavery was unconstitutional, slavery was not a crime in America. There was no penalty or federal law making it a crime for holding a person a slave. The complete American narrative is broad and perplexing. How it is explored by the documentary draws from artifacts such as case reviews from the Department of Justice. One case was that of 2 offenders holding a black man for 15 years. Upon review and based on a December 11, 1941 memorandum issued to the U.S. Attorney to investigate instances of slavery in America and to prosecute them, the case investigated near Corpus Christi saw the indictment and conviction of the offenders. They were sentenced to federal prison, thus marking the legal end of slavery in America in 1942. That was 78 years ago. The interplay of wealth, corporate conduct, and racial segregation is integral in telling this story. Companies such as J.P. Morgan played a role in the 1960s, funneling funds to wealthy white supremacists and segregationists who were fighting the civil rights movement in the South. Another corporation, U.S. Steel, relied on black labor in Alabama coal mines in the early parts of the 20th century. With this in mind, it brings us to address corporate social responsibility relating to social injustice. Why should I care about this story? It is not that history repeats itself, it also rhymes. Further, human beings are unoriginal in the ways we choose to torture and abuse one another. Our capacity for inhumanity is limitless. The criminal justice system and mass incarceration today still has a commercial leg where corporations make money from incarcerated or detained individuals. Private prison companies that are rewarded with more for more occupants. This becomes a case where profit is a variable in the equation of justice. We simply cannot allow this to happen. Based on Douglas Blackman's Pulitzer Prize-winning book, the film examines how involuntary servitude and forced labor were resurrected in the South in the decades after the end of the Civil War, often by the same industrialists who had begun experimenting with more harsh forms of slavery in the years prior to the war. At the heart of the new form of forced labor was a perversion of the criminal justice system to make one of its primary goals the intimidation of Black Americans and put them back into a position of subservience as laborers to whites. It's fundamentally the story of how slavery returned in America after it was supposed to have been abolished and persisted for decades, with terrible consequences for African Americans and the US society. How even as chattel slavery came to an end in the South in 1865, thousands of African Americans were pulled back into forced labor with shocking force and brutality. It was a system in which men, often guilty of no crime at all, were arrested, compelled to work without pay, repeatedly bought and sold, and coerced to do the bidding of masters. Tolerated by both the North and the South, forced labor lasted well into the 20th century. Slavery by Another Name is a moving, sobering account of a little-known crime against African Americans and the insidious legacy of racism that reverberates today. So we have Vanessa Moore. She's a member of Transforming the Connection. We have with us Mandy King. She actually is the founder of Transforming the Connection. We have Ann Slattery here with us as well, a member of Transforming the Connection, and myself, also a member of Transforming the Connection. So, Mandy, there's almost always a sense of shame. Next slide, please. There's always a sense of shame in white identity regarding slavery in America, and they got away with actions by dehumanizing blacks. Can you go ahead and speak to that for us?
One of the things that I've read and in my own interest, it's really come down to that, like, while we are not the ones that have built these systems and these institutions, they are in our hands now. So where do we go from here, and how do we start to adjust these things in a way that it can be more equal for all? It's our responsibility, really, to start addressing these things and not be lackadaisical about it, but it's really, who are we voting for? Why are we voting for them? In what ways in our own communities can we make a difference as far as things that are being upheld? Shame and guilt, in my own experience, and as anyone that's read Brene Brown knows, gets us nowhere. And it actually recenters white people, which is exactly what we're trying to move beyond. So I think it's one thing to observe and pay attention to those emotions that come up, but also to realize that they need to be set aside if we're to make any headway in moving forward. One of these ways, taking action is the thing, right? So one of these ways we can do that are reparations. This is actually coming about right now. 40 acres and a mule didn't happen. Not as big as it should have happened. Very often funds were given back to the farmers rather than the black laborers. So there is something going through right now with the Farm Bureau and the Biden administration where they are trying to give reparations to black farmers. This is being met with some opinions, of course. Another way is just communities. For instance, Evanston, Illinois is doing, on the marijuana laws, they are doing a taxation on those laws, and it's going back into descendants of Evanston, the black folks there, and it's going into their homes, into things of sustainability that can be carried forward and handed down generation to generation, trying to make up for those things of redlining and whatnot, where people were not getting mortgages and things like that that could be handed on or help with schooling. So those are just some of the ways that we can address shame and guilt and move beyond it to actively try to assist what has been done and better everyone.
Thank you, Mandy. Next slide, please. So, Vanessa, unlike the descendants of, for example, the Jewish community or Jewish Holocaust, there are no records to share. And so, can you go ahead and speak on that in terms of what that looks like for Black Americans?
Right. I think even just viewing the movie, we kind of saw as these black folks are telling their story of their descendants, you see that they don't know what happened to them after something happened in the court system or something happened to them on a farm. We don't have records of those. We didn't keep records of those types of things. Where we look at the Nazis, they were famous for record keeping. There are so many records, in fact, that there was 17 million victims, and there was 16 miles of shelves holding the stories of those victims. That's how many stories there were. And we have not done that in the United States, and I think that's one of the things that we need to look back on addressing in our history is how do we confront those stories, start record keeping as far back as we can go and those types of things.
Thank you.
And we should say, if anyone has anything to add at any point, please, if you comfortable in doing so. We want to open this up to everyone.
Since you said that, Mandy, I will say, as a librarian, on Ancestry.com, which we do have a library subscription here, they do have access to the Freedmen's Bank, which was their financial records of free black folks. So that is a really valuable record for a population that has very few records. So that's been, I've seen articles on how that has been utilized to find descendants of these people that were listed in the Freedmen's Bank. So that's one resource that we've accessed and we now have global access to through the internet that
Yeah.
people can.
Yeah, very cool.
Thank you.
So we were going to address the white savior. I
Next
don't
slide,
know how many have background or understanding of what this phrase means. So Jacqueline was going to address what it means, the white savior.
Right. A couple of things came up in regards to the concept of the white savior. And so in Southern courtrooms, so two of the legal methods that they had to keep men in forced labor, that they often found guilty of real fabricated crimes. And so when the men were unable to pay, the local businessman would step forward and pay the fine. Also, we could have a defendant who, wanting not to go to jail, go to prison, whatever it is, he would go ahead and he would sign a contract agreeing to work without having to pay that fine until that debt was paid off. And the defendant was faced with the likelihood of conviction. And so again, the white savior came in the form of a surety. So having that white man say, oh, by the way, I'm vouching for this person. And as we see moving forward, and as the documentary film stated, this form of coming in and saving a black man, it follows through. And it showed that to this day, right now, we're having to have this sort of system where if you don't have someone vouching for you, again, within the legal prison system, we do have that right now going on with different concepts of, oh, by the way, what's going on with this person in jail? Let's go ahead and form a group. And whatever the group is, most often headed by. So that's one of the things we look at as we move through the timeline and see how it permeates today. Mandy, when we talk about the criminalization of black skin and black lives, making it impossible for blacks in the rural South in the early parts of the 20th century to not be at risk for arrest at any time and the consequences of this, we want to look at what that looks like. And most of the offenses were trivial. So how do we address this, and what sorts of things today that we're seeing that kind of mimics this?
Well, again, we're seeing it right now in the states that have legalized marijuana, and there are people still in jail for minimal amounts. And, if it's okay in that state, why is the person still incarcerated? These things don't make sense. And again, I don't know if anyone's seen the documentary called Crack on Netflix. It's about cocaine, corruption, and conspiracy, and it talked about how, there's been some things with the government that are questionable that have fueled the incarceration, mass incarceration of a certain demographic of individuals in our country. I highly recommend watching that documentary. It really was, kind of blew some things open for me, so.
What was that called, ma'am?
Crack. And then it's cocaine, corruption, and conspiracy.
Since I'm standing right here too, we have this graphic novel called Cannabis, the Illegalization of Weed in America. And it talks about how specifically it was a racially driven illegalization. So it was yet another way that laws could be used to suppress and imprison black people. So
Thank you.
I'm gonna go put that on our
Yeah.
thing. So.
Thank you. And as Mandy brought up, so as you walk into the library today, you'll see that the library has provided some follow-up literature. Vanessa, the history of the American prison system, we have some long-term consequences, and these practices over the years has linked criminality to race. This is how America's purview of race was shaped. It got into the habit of being normal to see a huge population of black people, men in particular, incarcerated all the time. Can you go ahead and speak on that, please?
Yeah, and just, again, kind of going back to the movie, we kind of see how that started to begin, and how those stereotypes and things kind of navigated or kind of created what was that penal system. at the time. Now we fast forward to today, and just a little bit of research that I've done, what I was reading was that there was a 500% increase in the number of inmates over the last 40 years, despite decreasing crime rates. So there's this disconnect of the crime happening and somebody being put into prison. Most of the time it is a black male. There is factual evidence that this is the case in our communities, in our country now. And then I should go on to add that even though we have 5% of the world's population, the United States has 25% of the world's prison population. So when you start thinking about how industrialized we are, how many strides we make as being a open society, we're still imprisoning a large number of black people and poor people as well. So.
And the questioning private prisons and the industrialization that is happening within those prisons. If you start to pay attention to products that you buy and where they are made, there's a whole list of, from contacts to detergent, toilet paper that are made in private prisons. So it's still alive and well. Yeah.
Firefighters.
Oh,
Yes.
yeah.
Yes, as the West burns down, a good deal of the firefighters that are out there risking their lives are prisoners.
Yeah.
Not only are they prisoners, they get paid $1 a day for their labor, and then if they're released from prison, they're not allowed to be firefighters. Like that is the, that they've been doing this, risking their lives for years, and then they finally pay their debt to society, and they're trained to do this job, and then they get out of prison, like they're not allowed to. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
So in regard to the argument that slavery ended in 1942, 1865,
Right.
Jacqueline was going to address.
Right. So as Doug Blackman said, in the documentary, one of the arguments was that we had Reconstruction, we have the 13th Amendment. Next slide, please. We have the 13th Amendment, but if you look at the 13th Amendment and what's underlined here in this presentation, except as a punishment for a crime, whereof the penalty shall have been duly convicted. So as Blackman stated, without the conviction of those two people in Texas in 1942, we would have not understood that this type of neo-slavery, as he stated, was still in existence. So while this was 1875, and we're like, oh, by the way, the emancipation was passed, 1942, as Blackman stated, is when we officially can underscore that slavery ended in America.
And I would like to add to this, if that's all right, that there is an abolition amendment that has been presented, it has yet to be passed, that is looking to close this loophole. Yeah, it has not been pushed through yet, but.
So this loophole still exists.
Yeah.
I think when you look back at the timing of it, and you look at 1942, and you look at how, when our parents were born and how close that is to our generation, I think that, when somebody says, why are black people still angry? Why are they, why can't they get over this? Because it is so close to today, it's so close to their family. They've heard these stories from their grandparents, from their parents, and they, were still affected by these things as recently as 1942 and beyond that, because we know we have racism today, so.
And as we move forward, one of the things that we'll talk about why didn't we know these stories? So Mandy, we'll go ahead and we'll address this. Why didn't we know these stories?
Well, white guilt and shame. I think it's just the whole thing, or how can we be the greatest country in the world and have these misdeeds to our citizens happening? it just doesn't, we need to kind of keep this persona going forward. We cannot look vulnerable or weak in that way and say, no, we've screwed up and we have amends to, correct. So, yeah.
Which is also very different from how Germany dealt with the Holocaust and how they pay respect to, the mistakes that they made, because there was many people that were part of discriminating and enslaving Jews, and they look back at it in a different way, I think, than the way Americans do. And even if you just look at their historical figures,
Reparations.
Museums are completely different there. They focus on what happened there. They address what happened there, and we are very slow to do the same, I think.
Thank you. So the next couple of slides, what we wanted to show in the next couple of slides, next slide please. For example, in Missouri, so the new Democratic majority in control, they passed, this is in 1876, they passed what's known as pig laws, as you saw in the documentary. Next slide please. In Mississippi, the pig law made the farm animal worth more than $10, punishable up to 5 years in prison. And we did talk about next slide please. We did talk about judgments and contracts, which I kind of shared earlier when we talk about white guilt and what that looks like. And so this is, having this white person come and vouch for you and having this black male sign away basically his rights. So when we talk about what is he signing within these judgments and contracts, next slide please. And as we talk about the methods involved, I did touch on this, and so he's confessing this judgment that's being passed on him. And so what does that look like today for the history of the American prison system? Next slide, please. How is this permeating our society today? So there were different labor types, free laborers and convict laborers. There were juvenile convicts. And when this happened, you'll notice these are children. These are essentially children. As we look also at convicts leasing, so what does the system look like? How is the system moving forward? What's the wheels that's, moving the system forward? So convicts leasing, and so we talk about convicts leasing. Next slide, please. So we do give a definition. It's a form of labor that was legal and it occurred in concert with southern state and the county governments. When we talk about systemic, this is what systemic looks like. And this is how moving through the process, having systemic processes in place will keep a movement forward, moving it forward. And this is what we want to identify. Next slide, please. When we talk about our American prison system and the basis and foundation of our American prison system, we also want to look at chain gangs. And though many Southern citizens and politicians wanted to abolish convict leasing, the problem of the expense and difficulty of housing convicts remained. So chain gangs developed as a popular solution to that problem. Next slide, please. So, as you'll see during the presentation, you'll see that we're highlighting different areas, whether it's the South or even here in the Midwest. You'll be very surprised the different systems that were in place. So in Virginia, you see where they lease convicts for quarries and canals. Next slide, please. Which brings me to life in the coal mines. So coal mining required accumulated knowledge and skill to stay alive, and most convict labor, however, was simply numbing, and it was back-breaking labor. So as we move forward, and we're going to share a story about a particular person in the coal mines later on in the presentation, we'll kind of get an idea of what this looks like. Next slide, please. Again, we talk about places that had these systems in place. Arkansas leased convicts for coal mining, and they were blasting railroads to construct domestic private homes. Also, that's what they were doing. Next slide, please. How many of you have heard of company towns? Raise your hands. So quite a few of you have heard of company towns. Now, until I did this research, I'm not originally from America, so one of the things that was quite interesting to me as I did this research was the fact that these company towns existed on the backs of prominent industries that I grew up learning about in terms of the industrialized age as I studied history as a child, and companies that moved industrialization forward in America. And so America was the beacon up on the hill that everyone looked at in terms of having an industrialized society. So a company town that we want to talk about and why this is important to the Midwest, it was here in the Midwest in Illinois. Go ahead, next slide, please. Why is this important? Why should I care about this? We talk about social justice for a company. We talk about social justice for a movement, social responsibility. Why should I care? So the Pullman Company, and George Pullman was the builder of the railroad, and he developed one of the first and well-known company towns. So as you think about this, and as you think about the industrialized age and how you think about American companies that were right there at the forefront, how were these companies doing this job? How were these companies moving these towns forward? Who profited from this labor? How were these laborers compensated? How were their generations after them compensated? And what does it look like today for these descendants of these laborers? Next slide, please. And as we talk about the argument that slavery ended in 1942 on the presentation, we do talk about, and I shared this with you already. So this slide just shows that in Texas in 1942, this is technically as we look at the legal end of slavery, and so these two people were convicted there. Next slide, please. So this just kind of highlights, and you see at the bottom it says 1942, a white man was convicted. So this just kind of expands on the story and kind of shows the area in Texas where all of this took place. So now that we've kind of given you like a little bit of a background, Mandy, one of the questions that, you know, as we did this research and we talked about, why didn't we know about these stories? Why is it that this wasn't brought to the forefront in our history books? Why is it that, you know, it took someone from the South actually having a lived experience, moving out of the South, working for the Wall Street Journal, and then digging up a story that propelled further investigation that will bring us today to this documentary? Why don't we know about these stories? Next slide, please. Oh, right there.
So I don't know about you all, but when I reflect on what I was taught in history in high school, it was severely lacking. And there's a large amount of whitewashing that happens in these stories. I don't know if you've all heard of James W. Lowen. He actually died on Friday. He wrote the book, Lies My Teacher Told Me. I listened to it on audiobook last summer, and it absolutely blew me away, from the indigenous peoples to African Americans brought here to their ancestors. And he's done so much work on this. Actually, he has a whole web page you can go check out. He talks about sundown towns, all of these things.
We have that book.
It's, I mean, it reads like a history book, you guys. So maybe listening is an easier way to get through some of it. But it blew my mind open into how much I wasn't taught, and just kind of what gets skimmed across in order to keep things and everything working well, and not addressing where there are major issues still. So I think that's I think this is kind of keep the system moving, keep it going forward without paying attention to where we can do better.
Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States is very good too.
People's history of the United States.
Yeah.
History books are written by white people.
Yeah.
And Texas has a huge state which kind of monopolizes textbooks. So
That's exactly what I understand as well. And then, of course, when you get into the school system, who's determining what comes in and how much, and there's so much to determine, right, in a book, like what can we cover, and for those people that maybe aren't really versed in history but are in the school board, it becomes a very difficult thing to try to determine what books are best. So there's a lot of factors involved.
The political opinion of your teacher.
Yes.
When I look back on my history in high school.
Yes, there was outright racism in my history teachers in science.
It still happens.
So as we reflect on this, and just to kind of piggyback on what Mandy is saying in terms of her own introspection, and I'm sorry, ma'am, what's your name?
Macrina?
Macrina, right? So as I listen and as I hear you guys sharing with us, one of the things that I want you guys to think about is what's in place, what's encouraged, groups of people that are there, and why are they there? How are they encouraged to perpetuate racism? And one of the groups of people that were there was the Ku Klux Klan. Next slide, please. And as we talk about the Ku Klux Klan, we want to look at white supremacists and terrorism. What does that look like? And we do have a definition where it says white supremacy is the belief that white people are superior to other races of people. And the Ku Klux Klan was founded in 1865, and the Knights of the White Camellia were secret groups, while red shirts were publicly known. So these were not people hiding. They were in plain sight. There were groups of people that were there that were encouraged, often tolerated. So as we look back and we kind of think in our own self-reflection, how is it that they were aided to be terrorists and to terrorize another race or another group of people? Next slide, please. And where is it that you saw this unfolding? So if you look, we have on the slide in Louisiana, the Confederate veterans, they took part in the Colfax massacre and they organized the White League. Next slide, please. In Tennessee, the Confederate veterans formed the Ku Klux Klan in Pulaski, Tennessee, to promote white supremacy by terrorizing and murdering blacks and their allies.
Who were the Confederate veterans? Do you mean the veterans from the Civil War?
1866 to 1871, Confederate veterans formed the Ku Klux Klan.
Oh, from the, yeah.
Right.
The Civil War. Yeah.
Right.
Could be that time period.
Yes. All right, so with that in mind, we're just gonna go ahead and we're gonna share with you. So this is directly lifted from the film. So we wanted just to share with you, again, for those of us who kind of let it sit with you a little bit, the Green Cottenham story. So we do know from the documentary that he was arrested on a charge of vagrancy, and he could not prove that he had a job in 1908, and he could not pay those enormous fines. And he was sold to those coal mines on the outskirts of Birmingham to a company that was going to pay off his fines for a month, 1 month at a time. He died 5 months later upon the horrible conditions of the mine owned by the U.S. Steel Corporation. Again, as we talk about social responsibility, Anne, can you go ahead and speak to that just a little bit for us?
Well, like Macrina said, you are influenced by your teacher and their perspective. And when I was taught about the Emancipation Proclamation, she gave the aura of that Black people were ill-equipped to deal with freedom. And so I never learned, we talked about this, I never learned about these stories in school. So that's why learning about Green Cottonham is so important, and his story, how the system was set up, it's systematic, that you just fail. You can walk down a railroad track and be arrested. You can talk loudly in front of a white woman and be arrested. And his story just highlights that it's set up to fail and to just continue slavery. So, very important story.
Thank you. Next slide. Vanessa, as we talk about the American justice system, it's now becoming a system of injustice. We want to really look at what the business of neo-slavery. Is that Vanessa or is that, yeah.
So I think we also, not only do we, want to talk about this kind of stuff, but like the men and women who are convicted of a crime now in today's time are not only put in overcrowded, understaffed jails, waiting for their day in court. This is very true in urban areas especially. But for example, inmates in the Chicago jails in 2015 served the equivalent of 218 years more time waiting for their trial than their sentences they would ultimately be given. The housing for these inmates for this extra time cost taxpayers in Chicago $11 million. So when you think about all of these types of things that are happening and what we keep perpetuating, and how could we better spend the $11 million to
Uplift the community.
uplift a community that was, as Jacqueline had shown in Chicago, was dramatically affected by corporations, by the industrialization of the United States.
So why is it taking so long for them to come to trial?
Just the penal system.
Just the penal system in general. They're waiting for their day in court.
So there aren't enough judges?
Well, they don't have bail money either.
Yep.
Those
Yeah, they
ones
probably
would
don't have bail
pay a
money.
whole lot of
There's-
judges.
Yep. I think there's multiple reasons.
Setting them
there's-
up to fail.
Yep. I think there's multiple things that are set up for failure that we're just lacking, that we're not addressing.
We do have a copy of the letter by Carrie Kinsey, so you guys could take a look at this. And we do have an excerpt of the arrest of Green Cottonham. So I'll just go ahead and have Vanessa hand that out. And with that being said, I just want us to go ahead and
When was this letter written?
I think I flip it over on the other
Yes, on the other
side.
1903. I'm surprised at her handwriting.
Yes,
Negroes who were not to be taught
yes,
how to read and write.
yes, yes.
Where there's a will, there's a way.
There is a way. Yes. So as that's being passed around, I just want to bring our attention to this slide. And so in the documentary, they did mention that Martin Tabert, a white young man from North Dakota, he was traveling around the US and he's picked up in Florida and charged with vagrancy. And he is forced into labor at a lumber company and is dead at the hands of the whipping boss. This led to the end of convict leasing at the county level in Florida. Why is this important? Again, he is from the Midwest, okay? So it's not just in a vacuum that this is happening. This is someone from the Midwest that was able to affect change. This person, based on what happened to him, while it did not benefit himself, he died in the process, but recognized that he contributed greatly to something that was horrible ending. Why is that important? So, table number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5. Go ahead, speaker. You will share what your question is, and you will share with the larger group what you guys have decided.
All right, my name is Brandon, and my question is, at the end of the film, descendant Tanya Grooms paraphrases a quote from the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." What does this quote mean to you, and how can it be used to encourage continued action towards defending justice? This could be a very long conversation, obviously a lot of opinions, but I believe that man tries to be moral. I say I, but we feel like that in the efforts to try and be just, to try and, be perfect, the arc of the moral universe is long, that ideally we want to try and do what's best. And in trying to do what's best, man is not perfect. There are complications along the way. Things can be manipulated. If there's opportunity to steal, squander, these things are invariably, they happen. But ideally, truth is always the most important aspect. I believe that truth is a guiding principle, will always win at the end of the day, and understanding and recognizing when things are not working or things are broken, that you need to try and change and adapt to become more just, more truthful to yourselves and to others. So those are kind of the things that we touched on that particular quote.
Thank you, table number 1. Table number 2.
By 1890, the South State prison population had soared to nearly 19,000, and nearly 90% of those incarcerated were African American. What lingering effects could this hold for America now? Do you think there are any contemporary connections between the criminalization of Black life and prison population rates? Which I was just going to say, Vanessa pretty much answered earlier. Like the 500% something, would you say? Yeah. And then the system that we have right now still perpetuates people just staying stuck in there, not getting out, not having the resources to get out. And why would some of the for-profit prisons want to let people out, give them a way to get out? And I have a feeling they probably have people that are in government to keep that going, so they're not really looking out for them. They're looking for their money. So, I don't know.
Thank you, table number 2. Table number 3. What is your question, and how did you guys decide to answer?
Well, our question is, at the end of the Civil War, there was a rise in white vigilante groups in the South. What role did violence play in limiting the freedoms of blacks, and how is violence used today to control groups? And, we just said it's driving while black shouldn't be a crime.
Wow. Wow.
And that, to me and to all of us, is, it's just a perpetuating, it's that.
Or walking down a sidewalk in a neighborhood.
Walking down a sidewalk in a neighborhood, well, oh, who's that? It just shouldn't be not normal.
Thank you.
Wow.
Wow.
You guys
Yeah.
nailed it. Yeah.
Nailed it.
Yeah.
Nailed it. Thank you. Thank you, guys. All right. And next group.
Well, I'll read our question, and we have not come to a consensus. So, the end of Reconstruction ushered in oppressive legislation, such as the pig laws and vagrancy codes, that unjustly targeted African Americans. How did these laws criminalize black life and aid in the rise of the convict leasing system? And are there any laws now that you think unfairly target certain groups? Well, come on, kids. 'cause
Or we can throw it out there.
No, I think throw it out.
Throw it out.
Yeah.
Well, drug
The
crime.
thing of it is,
The war on drugs.
Yeah.
the laws, you gotta wonder about this. Why were the blacks standing around? Because they couldn't get a job, right? And why were they stealing pigs? Well, we don't know that they did, but obviously it must have been a problem. So,
We're hungry.
yeah, because they couldn't get a job. So, they picked those because those were the people who were doing those things. It was the black people that was doing them. So
they set them up to fail. They gave
Yeah.
them,
Yeah.
yes,
It'd
made it
be
a
like-
felony charge to steal a $1.
Someday they're gonna make it a prison sentence for smoking, and I'm gonna be up the creek.
Right.
Actually, I'm gonna be in prison.
But you see how preposterous that is?
Yeah.
So it's like making up these preposterous,
After the fact.
yes.
Yeah.
And then it's like, oh, and then utilizing these men's labor. I mean, it just is ridiculous.
And I don't know what laws now unfairly target. Perhaps it is the laws pertaining to drugs, but I think there's as many white people using drugs as there are black people. So,
Housing laws.
Housing laws.
Housing. Requiring certain financial statements or documentation, or, moving, what they call, income-assisted housing, but it's in, like, what people would consider the worst parts, where there's high instances of crime, and you're going, but that is where people of color who are on the lower scale of economic, the economic status can live. And so you get these neighborhoods, and then they say, oh, look at these neighborhoods, they're full of black people, and it's just nothing but trouble, and blah, 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 and it's not. It's a form of like housing and financial segregation. So, they don't, because there isn't truly an equal opportunity employer, you're seeing a lot of black people getting low-income jobs when they're perfectly capable of doing high-income jobs and should be, but they're not being hired, so then they're suppressed by getting these low paychecks, and then they have to live in poverty because of the system, and then people use them as an example of how bad that population is. And it has everything to do with what laws have done
Policy.
and policy has done,
And time.
and not what they've done.
The Indian reservations are a perfect example.
Yeah.
Just say it.
Well, Louisiana has the highest incarceration rate in the nation per capita, and Mississippi's number 2. And southern states such as Georgia and Florida and Texas and I can't speak to for sure which Tennessee are all in the top 10. And so that is sort of a reflection still today of higher incarceration rates.
Correct. So those laws are in place. And also, I am from back east, and one of the things that we talked about is having stop and frisk. And what does stop and frisk look like for a person of color? So is it unfairly targeting people of color, or is that something that it's just so random, it just so happened to be a person of color that is disproportionately targeted?
No.
Okay? So again, these are things that we think about. And then we do have someone here who has it.
Well, actually, I think these questions, you can't answer this kind of question, because regardless of the law, whatever the law was, the attitude of the people who are against the black will always find an excuse to take care of them.
Correct. That's a good point. That is a good point. Thank you so much for sharing that point. And again, as we move forward, how do we change attitudes? How do we change hearts and minds?
One person at a time.
One person at a time.
One library group.
One library group at a time.
When you look at social reform over the years, that's where social reform has
Yes.
happened. And,
Yes.
and we live in a very flawed country where yes, ideally our laws should reflect the majority, but unfortunately it's the lobbyists that make our laws, the money. And I think it's funny
Corporations.
that we see that big corporate America is now going to, we're going to globalization, and they're going to pay a price someday, because now all of the environmentalists want to pass laws that are going to put higher taxation on big business, and so it goes. What goes around comes around. They'll pay their dues, but unfortunately,
Isn't it Nabisco that's protesting? They walked out too. I think that happened today or yesterday. The wages and the long days and not, being compensated while they're making a ton of money, the main business. Not that that's related to this. I'm getting off
I
topic.
know, but
it's
it's all
it's intersection, yeah.
social injustice, and our history books do not reflect our true history, and it's only getting worse. They want to take more and more history out, and so we've gone through a lot of periods of revolution in America, and I miss the old time societies that got the work done. So I want to be part of something that's going to get the work done.
That's going to get the work done.
Yeah,
and we
not
talk
just
about,
talk.
thank you so much. We talk about grassroots movements and what does that look like. So at the grassroots level, where we have organizations like Transforming the Connection coming in and, being a voice for change. How do you affect change in your community? It starts here at the grassroots level. The fact that you came out tonight and you were able to see the documentary, participate in this discussion, this is how we begin to change hearts and minds. And
Wait. Table 4.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, our question goes back to the young man from North Dakota that was beaten to death. Do you think contemporary media is successful in bringing to light wrongdoings? In my estimation, we talked about this, probably wouldn't have happened if the young man wasn't white.
Right.
That kind of, it would have continued to go on.
Right.
Do you think there is more outcry over crimes when the victim is white? And if so, how can this inequity change? Sadly, I think last summer brought it out when George Floyd died, because it was televised. Thank heavens for that young woman that did tape it, that everybody got to see how terrible a black person's treated.
Thank you so much.
Cell phone cameras.
Next slide, please. All right. So as we close, I would like to thank you all for coming. So for further discussions, you can reach out to the Transforming the Connections Facebook page. But as you move to action, so this is just a starting point, how you understand connectedness and reconciliation. So this is what, the documentary did. Next slide, please. So how can you affect change? You can arrange and organize additional screenings. You can organize a leadership summit. And again, as I mentioned, you can contact our Facebook page. And again, we'd like to thank you. And in closing, I'd like to have Mandy say something.
So there are 2 Transforming the Connection pages. There's a public Facebook forward page that we'll share events on, and then there's a private page where we share materials that we're using for our own anti-racism struggles that we're maybe going through, things like that. If you are interested in being part of that group, please just private message me, Mandy with an I, not Barry Manilow, Mandy King, and I will invite you to that group.
Okay.
So
on behalf of myself, on behalf of Anne, on behalf of Mandy, on behalf of Vanessa, Amy and Mandy from Spencer Public Library, we'd like to thank you again for coming out tonight, and we really look forward to seeing how you go ahead in your community and affect change. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Don't